Hey guys, so it is now 10 o'clock, 10 p.m. I should say. So I'm here to just watch some videos. Yeah, so
Balik sa ako.
Alright, so I still don't know what videos to react. I'll be honest. I don't know actually. I don't know what videos to watch. Except I now have an idea. Go. There we go. We have so here are some videos that I could watch. Every US amendment, every paradox, every human extinction cause, every magic trick, every political ideology, every war tactic. Oh, there's a part 2. Huh, I should watch that.
Anarcho-communism. Anarcho-communism combines characteristics of Anarcho-communism. Anarcho-communism combines characteristics of anarchy and communism, advocating for the abolition of private property but the retention of personal. personal property and collectively owned items, goods, and services. Personal property includes items intended for personal use, such as a toothbrush, a house, clothes, and a vehicle. The owner has the right to exclude others from personal items. Private property, on the other hand, usually refers to something that generates value for its owner, like a factory or a mine. Private property usually generates capital without the owner necessarily having to perform any physical labor. Anarcho-communism believes in the abolition of the state and all structures of capital, leading to a stateless, classless, and post-monetary society where the population is given full control over policymaking. Neoliberalism. Neoliberalism has multiple competing definitions. It's generally associated with policies like privatization, deregulation, globalization, free trade, and reductions in government spending in order to increase the role of the private sector in the economy and society. It's sometimes also associated, on the libertarian left side, with managerial capitalism, which advocates for the dilution of ownership within society to a point where owners can no longer exert power over businesses, and rather this power being moved towards a professional manager class. Today, the term neoliberalism is usually thought to have a highly negative connotation. Social democracy. Social democracy advocates for economic and social interventions to promote social justice within a capitalist-oriented mixed economy. With both private and public businesses. It likes strong welfare programs, regulation of the economy in the general interest, and prefers reforms rather than revolutions. It likes the liberal democratic framework with separation of religions from the government, elections between different political parties, etc. Social democracy usually achieves the execution of welfare programs through progressive taxation. Social liberalism. While social democracy says that poor people should be helped through a strong welfare state, social liberalism focuses on making social mobility easier and on providing more equality of opportunities rather than equality in all domains. It likes a little bit of intervention from the government into the economy in the name of ensuring economic justice as well as civil liberty. Social capitalism. Social capitalism is a combination of social democracy, social liberalism, and capitalism. Third way. The third way tries to reconcile right-wing and left-wing politics, combining stances from social democracy and social liberalism. It supports workfare, which is a governmental plan under which people are required to accept public service jobs or to participate in job training to obtain the benefits. It also seeks a compromise between a purely free economic system as supported by classical liberals and a welfare state as supported by social liberals. One of the third way's key goals is to create a social investment state, which helps people climb the social ladder through workforce development and education, rather than handouts. Marxism. Marxism has developed over time into various branches and schools of thought, so no single, definitive Marxist theory exists. Classical Marxism seeks to create a communist society. It makes a distinction between the minority who owns the means of production, called the bourgeoisie, and the vast majority of the population who produce goods and services, called the proletariat. It says that capitalism exploits and oppresses the proletariat, making it an economically unsustainable model as it causes proletarian revolutions. Marxism also believes that history can be viewed in stages of development based on which class holds a dictatorship over the other classes, and that today, the world is under the dictatorship of the bourgeoisie. Following the overthrow of the bourgeoisie, Marxism believes that a dictatorship of the proletariat must be established to eradicate capitalism and begin the transition to communism. This stage, where the working class has absolute power over all other classes and has ownership of the means of production, is usually called socialism. Leninism. Leninism, also known as Bolshevism, believes in the establishment of a dictatorship of the proletariat led by a revolutionary vanguard party. The Revolution Vanguard Party should be composed of the most educated workers, with the objective of educating larger sections of the working class and starting the revolution. Neo-libertarianism. Neo-libertarianism thinks that the libertarians' value of freedom from interference by other
Wow, nakapatay si Clark. Kuya, paano mag-spell ng labor? Ha?
Kuan. Niyan. N-E I-G-H B-O-R, neighbor.
Packing mo, papacking mo her. Sa Manoy, Princess Odette. Patay! Just do it again.
Libertarian value of freedom from
Other people is incompatible with a strictly limited government, and thus it is generally supportive of government involvement in society as long as it promotes greater liberty. It is sometimes associated with neoconservatism, which is the idea that typically advocates the promotion of democracy and interventionism in international affairs, including peace through strength. Classical liberalism. Classical liberalism
when the United States tried neo-conservatism before, it did not work. So
Easy win. Oh. Huh?
Liberalism thinks that individual freedom and a free market create a balanced economic equilibrium as long as monopolies aren't allowed to develop and
Diyan sa mana si Clark, down sa mana. Ano si Clark? Oh, sa mana si Clark doon. Oh. Nag-short si Dani. Oh, the people super here.
destroy competitiveness. It sees free trade as a path to universal peace and prosperity, and it likes as little government intervention as possible. If compared to social liberalism, it thinks more negatively about social policies and taxation, and it advocates deregulation. Anarcho-capitalism. Anarcho-capitalism is anarchist because it doesn't like a centralized state, and it's capitalist because it likes systems of private property enforced by private agencies, free markets, and self-ownership. As no centralized state would exist, there would be no taxation, and private companies would take the role of the police. Nationalism. Nationalism holds the belief that the nation should be congruent with the state. A nation is a large type of social organization where a collective identity has emerged from a combination of shared features across a given population, such as language, history, ethnicity, etc. A state is a centralized political organization that imposes and enforces rules over a population within a territory. One of nationalism's key goals is to maintain its sovereignty over its homeland, usually through a nation-state. It holds that each nation should govern itself, free from
Ala, maayo ba kayo na Shirley? Spirits will help. Oh, naku, man kayo nag-damage. The Star Wars. Si Master Yoda will help me. Sir?
from outside interference. When a nation puts its own interest above all others at any cost, it's called ultranationalism. The opposite of ultranationalism is universal nationalism. Georgism. Georgism, also known as the single tax movement, thinks that although people should own the value that they produce themselves, the value derived from land should belong equally to all members of society. It believes that there should only be one tax, the land value tax, because it views property rights as only extending to the properties of labor and capital, and since land is neither, it's free real estate. Radicalism. Radicalism, or radical liberalism, was a historical set of movements within classical liberalism and represented the left wing of the historical movement. Radical liberalism took the principles behind liberalism and applied them to its conclusion. For example, a classical liberal might espouse that a democratic system of government and the right to vote should be given. In turn, a radical liberal would take such a statement to its conclusion that being that women, those without property, immigrants, slaves, etc., should all be given the right to vote.
All the people superheroes feel strawberry. Dugay pa ni Mayo. Loko! Dili, dugay pa ni Mayo. Napanawa lang tayo. Dr. Strange, Black Widow, Iron Man, Hulk. Loko!
Corporatocracy. Corporatocracy is an economic system in which the state intervenes within the economy for the benefit of a select number of corporations, especially in the context of squashing competition. A variant of corporatocracy is lemon socialism, which is a pejorative term for an economic system based on a government that offers subsidies to weak, bad, or bankrupt companies so that they remain in the market.
Oh, basin. Tengah sampai tengah. Clark, pati na si Zilong, Clark.
Cyberocracy. Cyberocracy represents the advocacy of a government that is largely automated or partially automated and de facto ruled by computers and artificial intelligence. Integralism.
I don't know if that system of government would work out. Like, I just don't know if it will. A nation run by computers and AI that is bleak should not be something we should be optimistic about. So, yeah, we're humans. We don't want an entity that we don't know much about to rule us all. That's the thing about us. We don't want for some things that are uncertain.
One hit. Loko!
Yeah, we don't want uncertain things to happen, you know, especially when
Sanay! AS
your country is under a cyberocracy. Cyberocracy.
Integralism is the principle that the church should be the basis of public law and public policy within civil society. It's usually a deeply traditionalist doctrine, and it doesn't like secularism, reactionarism.
It's not gonna work as well, let's be honest. That's not gonna work.
Reactionarism is a philosophy that advocates for the restoration or preservation
Meeting up. Robbie si Clark. Robbie si Clark. Hilong-hilong ra, pero legendary na.
preservation of traditional social, political, and economic systems. It is characterized by a rejection of progressive or liberal ideas and a belief that society has become too modern or innovative. Jacob.
Reactionarism. What, old civil laws? What, not have the right, not have women the right to vote? Not have slaves the right to vote? Still having slavery in the city? What do they mean by old? How old? That's the real question. How old? You know, like, where's the boundary between pretty old and too old? Because if anything, if we would go with this specific definition of reactionarism, we could go as far old as the 1600s, where not even Irish people had the right to vote, or voting wasn't even a thing. So, you know,
Beanism. It's the philosophy of a complete dismantling of an old system with a completely radical and new structure. It's historically seen as one of the most revolutionary and important movements throughout modern history, as it played a huge role in the French Revolution, where monarchy was abolished and replaced by a republic. I'll be making a part 3. Subscribe and activate the bell to see it.
He's making a part 3.
Kita ko ni Saber.
Ooh. You could go with every propaganda technique. No, that's a good one. Or every Greek god, every bias. Just go with every bias.
Bias blind spot. The tendency to think that oneself is less affected by cognitive biases compared to others. Gambler's fallacy. Gambler's fallacy happens when there's a tendency to bias blind spot. The tendency to think that oneself is less affected by cognitive biases compared to others. Gambler's fallacy. That oneself is less affected by cognitive biases compared to others. Gambler's fallacy. Gambler's fallacy happens when there's a tendency to think that future probabilities are altered by past events, when in reality they are unchanged. Omission bias. It's the tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful inactions. Tendency to judge harmful actions as worse or less moral than equally harmful inactions.
Oh, omission bias.
Proportionality bias. Our innate tendency to assume that big events have big causes.
That's correct.
Proportionality bias.
Look at that icon. It looks so cute. You know, like that. It looks so cute. It looks incredibly cute. Yeah. This thing looks insanely cute. Bruh. Damn, son. Hold on.
Our innate tendency to assume that big events have big causes, which may also explain our tendency to accept conspiracy theories. Moral credential effect. It occurs when someone who does something good gives themselves permission to be less good in the future. Self-serving bias. It's the tendency to claim more responsibility for successes than failures. Framing effect. The tendency to claim more responsibility for successes than failures. Framing effect. The framing effect is the tendency to draw different conclusions from the same information, depending on how. The framing effect is the tendency to draw different conclusions from the same information, depending on how that information is presented. This includes the contrast effect, which is the enhancement or reduction of a certain stimulus's perception when compared with a recently observed
Yeah, that's a contrast effect. That's a pretty good example. Like, this wombat looks tiny and cute, but yeah. It's why videos like this on TikTok get way more views than it should have. So.
Contrasting object. Actor-observer bias. It's the tendency for explanations of other individuals' behaviors to overemphasize the influence of their personality and underemphasize the influence of their situation, and for explanations of one's own behaviors to do the opposite. Picture superiority effect. The notion that concepts that are learned by viewing pictures are more easily and frequently recalled than are
Picture superiority effect.
Concepts that are learned by viewing their written word form counterparts. Outcome bias. It's the tendency to judge a decision by its eventual outcome instead of the quality of the decision at the time it was made. Mere exposure effect. The mere exposure effect is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop liking or disliking for things merely because they are familiar with them. Hard, easy effect. It's the tendency disliking for things merely because is a psychological phenomenon by which people tend to develop liking or disliking for things merely because they are familiar with them. Hard, easy effect. It's the tendency to overestimate one's ability to accomplish hard tasks and underestimate one's ability to accomplish easy ones. Survivorship bias. Survivor and
tendency to overestimate the ability to accomplish hard tasks and
underestimate one's ability
for easy tasks. This is definitely me. I have this kind of bias. I'm a human. We have all the biases. So
to accomplish easy ones. Survivorship bias. Survivorship bias happens when concentrating on the people or things that survived some process and inadvertently overlooking those that did not because of their lack of visibility. Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. The overlooking those that did not because of their lack of visibility.
Facebook has it says thanks to likes and likes first.
Visibility. Baader-Meinhof phenomenon. The Baader-Meinhof phenomenon, also called frequency illusion, is the illusion where something that has recently come to one's attention suddenly seems to appear with very high frequency shortly afterwards. The reality is that before we placed our attention on that element, we just ignored it. Availability heuristics. The availability heuristic is the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of events that easily come to mind. The availability of memories can be influenced by how recent they are or how unusual or emotionally charged they may be. Dunning-Kruger effect. It's the tendency for unskilled individuals to overestimate their own ability and the tendency for experts to underestimate theirs. Halo effect. It's the tendency for a person's positive or negative traits to spill over. Halo. To overestimate their own ability and the tendency for experts to underestimate theirs.
Yeah.
Halo effect. It's the tendency for a person's positive or negative traits to spill over from one personality area to another in others' perceptions of them. Pygmalion effect. The phenomenon whereby others' expectations of a target person affect the target person's behavior in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Decoy effect. Pygmalion effect. The phenomenon whereby others' expectations of a target person affect the target person's behavior in a self-fulfilling prophecy. Decoy effect. This bias is widely used in marketing. It's the phenomenon whereby consumers will tend to have a specific change in preference between two options when also presented with a third option that is asymmetrically dominated.
Wait, what? $300 for 200 photos. Okay. We have $400 for 300 photos. And $450 for 250 photos. He probably put that by mistake. I think it should be $350 for 250 photos. I am immune to all biases except that first one. Oh, we don't know. Huh. So I think that was on purpose. He didn't make any corrections. Right.
An option is asymmetrically dominated when it is inferior in all respects to one
The marketer wants this. Oh.
option, but in comparison to the other option, it is inferior in some respects and superior in others. Selection bias. Selection bias is the bias introduced by the selection of selection bias. Selection bias is the bias introduced by the
Sama na si Luffy.
Selection bias is the bias introduced.
selection of individuals, groups, or data for analysis in such a way that proper randomization is not achieved, thereby failing to ensure that the sample obtained is representative of the population not achieved,
Proper randomization.
thereby failing to ensure that the sample obtained is representative of the population intended to be analyzed. Anchoring bias. The anchoring bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on one trait or piece of information when making decisions, usually the first piece of information acquired on that subject. This is why first impressions are so important. They paint a picture of what the other person is, and that picture gets anchored, making it hard to change. This bias is often exploited during negotiations. When the seller gives a seemingly unreasonable high price, that price becomes the starting point for the negotiation, and the buyer inadequately adjusts from it. Confirmation bias. Confirmation bias is the tendency to search for, interpret, focus on, and remember information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. Overconfidence effect. Focus on and
The tendency to what's the first? Oh, the bias blind spot. Okay. I get this one. I am immune to all biases except that first one. He is not immune to any of the biases. And even though there were different types of bias, this is how it educate.
Ha? Oh, may pag-uwi,
Manipulation technique. Tendency to search for it.
remember information in a way that confirms one's preconceptions. Overconfidence effect. The overconfidence effect is the tendency to have excessive confidence in one's own answers to questions. For example, for certain types of questions, answers that people rate as 99% certain turn out to be wrong 40% of the time. Egocentric bias. Egocentric bias is the tendency to rely too heavily on one's own perspective or have a higher opinion of oneself than reality. Examples of this are the false consensus effect, which is the tendency for people to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them, and the false uniqueness bias, which is the tendency to overestimate the degree to which others agree with them, and the false uniqueness bias, which is the tendency of people to see their projects and themselves as more singular than they actually are. Information bias. Information bias is a cognitive bias to seek information when it does not affect action. Hindsight bias. The cognitive bias
If I learned the horoscope, I'll always get it right.
bias to seek information when it does not affect action. Hindsight bias. The hindsight bias is sometimes called the I knew it all along effect, and it is the common tendency for people to perceive past events as having been more predictable than they actually were. Projection bias. It's the tendency to overestimate how much one's future selves will share one's current preferences,
Projection bias.
thoughts, and values, thus leading to the suboptimal choices. Will share one's current preferences, thoughts, and values.
I do not have this kind of bias. Sometimes.
Thus leading to suboptimal choices. Apophenia. Apophenia is the tendency to perceive meaningful connections between unrelated things. This bias is one of the ways a stereotype can lead people to expect certain groups and traits to fit together, and then to overestimate the frequency with which these correlations actually occur. Another type of apophenia is pareidolia, which happens, for example, when you see images of animals in the clouds. Serial position effect. The serial position effect is the tendency of a person to recall the first and last items in a list better than the middle ones. Recency bias. The recency bias gives greater importance to the most recent event, such as an interviewer who can vividly remember just the last person he interviewed because they're the most recent conversation they had. It's related to the serial position effect. Authority bias. Authority bias is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure, no matter what the is the tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure, no matter what the opinion's content is. Unit bias. The standard suggested amount of consumption, like the food serving size, that's perceived to be appropriate. A person would consume it all, even if it was too much for that particular person. Availability cascade. It's a self-reinforcing process in which a collective belief gains more and more plausibility through its increasing repetition in public discourse. It can be summarized in the phrase, repeat something long enough and it will become true. It's related to the availability heuristic, bandwagon effect. It's the
Wait, what?
will become true.
Repeat something long enough and it will become
It's related to
the availability heuristic. Oh, it's when you see something that is recent, emotionally changed you or unusual, then you are going to like project it onto some things even though it's not that big of a chance for that to happen or something like that. I don't know, I didn't remember much with the availability heuristic. Where was here it is. Here's availability heuristic.
the availability heuristic, bandwagon effect. It's the tendency to do things because many other people do the same.
Oh, bandwagon effect. I have this bias. Sometimes I do have this bias, but in other cases I don't, because there are cases that I simply just don't agree with some things. So
This effect can happen for two reasons. Conformism, when someone wants to fit in with others, or lack of information, where the person thinks that the opinion of many people is probably more accurate than just his. Illusory truth effect. People are more likely to identify as true statements those they have previously heard, even if they cannot consciously remember having heard them. Next in line effect. When taking turns speak, even if they can.
did you know that vitamin C prevents?
Even if they cannot consciously remember having heard them. Next in line effect. When taking turns speaking in a group using a predetermined order, like going clockwise around a room, people tend to have diminished recall for the words of the person who spoke immediately before them. In-group bias. In-group bias is the tendency for people to give preferential treatment to others they perceive to be members of their own groups. It usually happens because we encounter and interact with people in our group much more frequently than with strangers. This makes people in our group seem unique, while people outside of our group seem boring and conformist. The mere exposure effect also plays a role in this bias. Spotlight effect. It's the sensation that everybody is focused on us that comes from overestimating the extent to which other people notice our appearance or behavior. Choice supportive bias. The tendency to remember our choices as better than they actually were, because we tend to over-attribute positive features to options we chose and negative features to options not chosen. Ostrich effect. People options we chose and negative features to options not chosen. Ostrich effect. People tend to bury their head in the sand and avoid potentially negative but useful information just to avoid psychological
Ostrich effect.
discomfort. Selective perception bias. It's the tendency not to notice and more quickly forget stimuli that cause emotional discomfort and contradict our prior beliefs. Peak end rule. People seem to perceive not the sum of an experience, but the average of how it was at its peak and how it ended. I'll be making similar videos. Subscribe to see them.
Alright, so it's now nearly 15 minutes or so. It's nearly a quarter till 11 o'clock. And I think it is time to